For us lads of 18, they ought to have been the ones that would help us transition, who would guide us into the adult life, into a world of work, of responsibilities, of civilized behaviour, and of progress, into the future. Quite often, we ridiculed them and played tricks on them, but basically, we believed in them. In our minds, the idea of authority, which is what they represented, implied deeper insights and a more humane wisdom. But the first dead man that we saw shattered this conviction. We were forced to recognize that our generation was more honorable than theirs. They only had the advantage of us in phase-making and cleverness. Our first experience of heavy artillery showed us our mistake, and the view of life that their teaching had given us fell to pieces under that bombardment. While they went on writing and making speeches, we saw field hospitals and men dying. While they preached the service of the state as the greatest thing, we already knew that the fear of death is even greater. We saw that there was nothing left of their world, and suddenly we felt horribly alone. This paragraph on page 9 in chapter 1 from All Quiet on the Western Front depicts Paul's anger and disdain at the older generations. This paragraph is a betrayal by the older generations as they preach that the sacrifice of one's life has no greater reward than receiving the words of honor and patriotism for one's memory of the dead. For the younger boys new to the army, the older generations were supposed to be mentors, teachers, and guides to the new men in the army, to teach them how to fight in the war, to help them transition into responsible, strong men, and into men who would live in a world of work and civilized, structured lives. Paul explains that the young men took the leaders as teachers, in parents in which they could relate. But this relation was wrong. The boys in uniforms counted on leaders such as Cantorek to be leaders to guide them into the future, with lessons they could use for the rest of their lives. They thought they would protect the boys and just demonstrate the qualities of bravery and courage which had been preached. But once the war began, the boys realized that the older generation had failed them. But the first dead man we saw shattered this conviction. Paul explains that the first dead man he saw destroyed his belief of trust and faith in officers of authority. He explains that once he saw the first man die, the lie they told of helping them, teaching them, and preaching their qualities shown by all soldiers was destroyed by the sight of seeing one of his comrades fall, without the symbolic sacrifice that the army preached was the greatest reward for all men and soldiers alike. Paul emphasizes that the older generation, which is constantly ready to criticize and ostracize young men for signs of cowardice or unpatriotic behavior, has not itself experienced the war. It has no understanding of what the fighting is actually like. The younger generation must look to themselves to determine what is true and right because the older generation has proved itself incapable of teaching them. While they were writing and making speeches, we saw field hospitals and men dying. While they preached the service of the state as the greatest thing, we already knew that the fear of death is even greater. We saw that there was nothing left of their world, and suddenly we found ourselves horribly alone. These sentences reinforce the mistakes and highlight the lies in which the officers of the army told to the young boys of Germany, to inspire them to believe that the war was a great event full of bravery, courage, and the glory of sacrifice. Paul explains, while the army made inspiring and rousing speeches, the men had already seen the destruction and the horrible effects of war on men, who had thought the sacrifice they gave would be an event for all mankind to remember, but in reality was just another statistic for an army's death count. When the men of the army found that fighting for their country wasn't an act of the bravest man and the most courageous of humanity, they found that death was even greater fear than they had any other experienced. While the officers found that the war was finally lost, their worlds were destroyed as their authority was reduced to rubble. The men of the army found their lives had no direction and nowhere to go after all had been taken.